Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
We're in a marvelous, marvelous chapter today. Matter of fact, it's the foundation for the rest of the Bible. We're going to be looking at the first 23 verses of Genesis chapter 1. I would like to set the stage for our study by making 7 statements about Genesis 1. It sounds pretty biblical, 7 statements, doesn't it? And I hope you'll think through these because they're based on a lot of study, a lot of prayer, and they try to articulate my presuppositions. For all of us have those when we come to the Bible. But analyzing what they are helps us to remove our biases as much as possible. Okay? Number 1, the great truth of this chapter is not how, but who, moving rapidly toward why. You know, Genesis is 50 chapters long. The first 11 set the stage for the remainder. And the focus of Genesis is God choosing a people to choose a world that had fallen and rebelled against Him. Number 2, be careful not to be totally caught up in the theories and thought forms of your day. Genesis has outlived many theories and will outlive our day also. Genesis is written in the language of description, not in the language of Western technological science. The book is not anti-scientific. The book is pre-scientific. Science will fight against itself, and views will come and go, and hypotheses will change. But friends, this is the Word of God. Number 3, Genesis reflects true knowledge, but not exhaustive knowledge. For sinful, finite man cannot fully understand a holy, infinite God, especially in the very beginning. It is given to us in ancient thought forms, but it is infallible truth. It is related to its day, but it is unique in its day. It speaks of the inexpressible, yet it speaks truly. Basically, it is a world view, not a world picture. And those are philosophical terms. That means it's primarily showing us why and who, not necessarily a detailed how. Number 4. Without Genesis 1 through 3, the Bible is incomprehensible. Notice how quickly the story moves from God to Israel. Creation forms an integral but passing piece of the account of God's choice of Israel. Creation is the backdrop or the stage on which God and man will interrelate. That's why it's geocentric. Number 5. Your answer to the question, what is the purpose of inspiration and revelation, will affect the way you see Genesis 1. If you see the purpose as the impartation of facts about creation, you will view this chapter in a certain bias. If, however, you view the basic purpose as the establishment of a relationship between God and man, you will possibly see its emphasis in another area. Number 6. The main thrust of this chapter is theological. That does not say, and does not mean to say, that it is not historical. But the main element is God, and that God did it out of His will, for His purposes, in His time, in His way. He brought it into being. He will consummate it. It always amazed me that Christians fight so much over how it all began and how it's all going to end when they can't affect either one. Number 7. Be careful of men and their presuppositions and philosophies, even when they have good intentions. The greatest minds of the church have disagreed on this. This is not an area to establish conservatism. It's an area where we struggle for understanding. With that in mind, let's look at the biblical text. Now, I realize that this text has been interpreted many, many ways. I'm going to try to give you what I think is a true exegetical understanding without reading too much of my own biases in here, though I certainly have them. In the beginning. This seems to set the stage for the beginning of time, beginning of history. But you know that God's activity, of course, His essence, His personhood, and His activity, not only in creation, in thinking through the plans before He brought it into being, but His redemptive plans started long before in the beginning. You say, well, what do you mean? Let me give you a few scriptures where it shows God's activity and plan even before the beginning of creation. First, look up Titus chapter 1, verse 2, and then 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. And then here are a series of verses that talk about before the foundation of the earth. Matthew 25:34, John 17:5 and 24, Ephesians 1:4, 1 Peter 1:19 and 20, and Revelation 13:8. This even predates the idea of Proverbs 8:12 through 23 about wisdom being with God and helping God create the earth, which I think is probably the background for John chapter 1, verse 1. This is not about the origin of God. This is about how God began working with men in time. In the beginning. Now, notice it says God. The word here is Elohim. Now, it's a plural form. Whenever a Hebrew word has I-M on the end, it makes it plural. I think it's the plural of the general name for God in the ancient Near East, El. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about what this means. If you'll notice through here, look at the number of times Elohim is used in chapter 1. The rabbis say it speaks of God in His power and creatorness. And I think that's true. For I personally reject the JEDP theory of source criticism that tries to find different sources. In my opinion, the Pentateuch is Mosaic. Now, he may have used sources, oral and written, but I think God revealed to Moses in a unique way these first 5 books. Now, notice where it says created. The word here is the Hebrew word bara. Now, I realize that there's been some discussion about is this term synonymous with other Hebrew terms, but I really think this is a unique Hebrew word that is used only in the Old Testament of God creating. Now I realize it may be saying too much here for me to speak about creation ex nihilo, which is Latin for out of nothing, but I really think the inference is here. Now there are other cosmologies. And we're going to talk about them in verse 2 because there's really a hair pull there. But of course the Babylonian Sumerian cosmology made matter and spirit in the form of 2 gods co-eternal. One of them was male, one of them was female. APSU is male and Tiamat is female. One of them represents, we think, in the account, fresh water and salt water, but one seems to be used to stand for matter and one seems to be used to stand for spirit. Now that shows the ontological dualism in those accounts. This same ontological dualism is seen in Greek philosophy and cosmology, where matter and spirit are co-eternal. The biblical account is not like that. First there is God, spirit, and out of only spirit, God creates matter. Matter is not something that has eternality in itself. Matter is not independent. Matter is a creation of God, controlled by God, formed by God. And so I believe that bara has the idea of ex nihilo. It says He created the heavens and the earth. Now, obviously, we're going to talk about the heavens meaning the abode of the God, the spiritual realm, and the earth meaning this planet. The Genesis 1 is geocentric. That is not to deny scientific views of the universe and other universes. It is simply to say that the Bible is written to show man and God's relationship. It is geocentristic or terra firma oriented because that is the theological setting of God and man's relationship. Now notice where it begins. In verse 2. There's been much discussion about how verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3 are related. Many modern dispensationalists try to make verse 2 the clause that to which verse 1 is dependent. In my opinion, verse 1 is an independent clause describing God's creative act. Verses 2 and following is another account that shows the specialization, the progress, and the differentiation in God's creation. Verse 2, some say it's a parenthesis. It is a certain construction in Greek grammar that has a threefold description of the state of the earth at God's first creation. I do not think that the earth was created good and then fell. That's what dispensationalists try to make in verse 2, the fall of a pre-Adamic race, maybe angelic. I reject that. That is more theological than exegetical. It does say that God created in a progressive way. And this progressive way, it started out rather, I don't want to say chaotic because that gets so confused with these other creation accounts and cosmologies. He started at a lower level and diversified, specialized, developed. And I think that's what verse 2 is about. There are three statements here about the earth. We're not going to talk about the development of heaven, but the development of earth. What happened to it? Well, first and originally, it was formless and void. Second, there was darkness over it. And third, the Spirit of God was hovering over it. Now that says two things. People say this is chaos and God brought order out of chaos. No. This is showing that even in this beginning stages of what seemed to be lifeless earth, it certainly was uninhabited and uninhabitable at this point, but God was still involved. God's Spirit was involved. This is not a fight between God and matter. This is God involved at every stage of His creation and bringing it to the state of perfection and inhabitability for the prime subject of His creation, which is man. The earth was. Now, formless and void. These two words always appear together. I think you may want to go back to Isaiah 45:18 about the concept that God's purpose in creation was an inhabitable world. It was uninhabitable at this point. Now, darkness. Is darkness something evil, independent of God? Many folks try to say that. But God's going to name darkness. The fact He names it shows He controls it. Darkness is as much a part of the creation of God as is light. Darkness is not evil here. This is not the Johannine dualism. This is not Zoroastrian dualism that'll later develop, that use light and darkness as metaphors for something else. This is simply, it was dark, and then God created light. Now, on the surface of the deep. Now, many have said here, this, of course, is a Hebrew form that it sounds a lot like a personified form of the word ocean or deep, which in the particularly the Sumerian and Babylonian creation account called En Uma Elish. Now that is right here. This is the Babylonian Genesis. Okay? You probably ought to get this book and read it. It has some things in common, but it is quite different. It's polytheistic. Monsters are fighting. How different that is from the creation account of the Bible. But in this Babylonian Sumerian creation account, Tiamat, which is the word they use to personify the female goddess that is going to try to wipe out the lesser gods that came from her, and Marduk, one of these other gods, is going to defeat her, cut her in half, and create heaven and earth out of her body. That is so different from what we have here. Matter of fact, the author of this book, Alexander Heidel, says that that word Tiamat cannot even be related etymologically to the Hebrew word used here. And I think we need to see that. Now notice it says the Spirit of God. Some try to say the word spirit is the word for wind and came to mean breath, and then the idea of spirit. And I think that's true, that development is true. But you can't say a great storm was over the earth or a great wind blew over the earth. It's obvious here because of the parallelism between Elohim and spirit, that this is the Spirit of God. Now, is it the full-blown Trinitarian sense? Probably not. But it does show God's activity even at this primeval state of voidness and barrenness. Now, notice where it mentions here, and God said. Now, this is the concept in theology. If you'll look through here, God said several times. Of course it's anthropomorphic. All of this is anthropomorphic. God said, God saw, God called. All those are speaking about God as if He was a man. But how else can we speak about God? Our language is limited to human words. And so we project on God a human personality. That's why all theology is adequate, maybe, to describe truth, but not exhaustive to describe God. So God said. This has developed into the Hebrew concept of the power of the spoken word. Now we see it clearly in Psalms 33, 6 and 9. We see it in Isaiah 55, 11 and 12. It's the idea, we see it in the patriarchal blessings. When God speaks, it almost has an independent existence. When man speaks in God's name, it has an independent existence. This is the basis for our view from the Latin called creation by fiat, or by the spoken word. We usually say God spoke and out of nothing things came. Fiat ex nihilo. Now this is simply saying that God brought everything that is into existence simply by speaking it. And notice the number of times through here it says God said. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Now notice now that the creation, by the way, you might want to see Hebrews 11:3 and 2 Peter 3:5 for God speaking the world into existence. Now the idea of light here, notice that the sun is not going to be created till much later in this account. This is not light in the sense of 24-hour days. Now when I get to the word day, I want to deal with that. We can't be dogmatic. These are 24-hour days, one cycle of the earth at this point. I don't say it's a exegetical truth. We can make ages or epochs here either. But I do say we've got to be careful. The Hebrew word yom for day can mean a long period, and there is a possibility here of that because light comes before the sun, and there are several days before the sun is created. Now, let there be light, and there was light. Okay? By the fact, you want to see a beautiful place. In Revelation 22:5, there is no sun there, but there's still light because God's present. And God saw that the light was good. Now, in chapter 1, verse 31, when all creation is through, it's going to say it's very good. This is God affirming that creation in and of itself is good. It's not the Greek dualism of matter being evil and God being good. No, things were good and man fouled up everything. Now, and God separated the light from the darkness. Well, how did He do that? Well, I'm not real sure. It simply means He made a differentiation between light and darkness. Verse 5. And God called the light day. Now here is God naming. God's going to name several times. The fact that He names it shows His ownership, authority, and power over it. God is not controlled by nature. Nature is controlled and sustained by the Creator God. Now, notice where it says, and the darkness He called night. He named that too. It isn't evil. It's a creation, and He named it. And there was evening and there was morning, day one. Now the word yom here, and in several other places, can be used for a long period of time, an age. Let me give you a few. Genesis 2:4, Genesis 5:2, Psalms 90 verse 4, Isaiah 4:2. Don't let your presuppositions determine the text. Usually the word yom means simply a day, but it can mean a longer period. I don't reject somebody who disagrees with their interpretation of Genesis 1 based on what they do with a 24-hour day. To me, the most central truth is that God did it in His time, in His will, for His purpose. Matter of fact, the sermon I do on Genesis 1 says, not how, but who moved rapidly toward why. I personally believe in 6 literal days, but that is not the most significant thing of this exegesis. Now, then in verse 6, and God said, let there be an expanse. Now the word expanse means a hammered out dome. Now what this basically means is there was water on the earth, around the earth, and there was water above the earth. It was kind of a dense fog where the two weren't separated. So God caused an envelope of air, a vault of atmosphere between the water on the earth and the water in the clouds. Maybe so the light could be seen. But whatever, He made a space where man could view His world. And that's what this is talking about. An air vault, a dome, the atmosphere is what this is. In the midst of the waters. Now, the word water is a very significant element in both the Egyptian cosmology, the Phoenician cosmology, and the Vedic literature. But here it's not a significant thing. It's created by God. It's controlled by God. It serves God's purpose, but it's not an independent creation. I think that's important. Let's see. You know, I forgot something I wanted to say to you. When I read this Phoenician cosmology in my notes, it reminded me. Can I go back just for a minute to verse 2 where it says the Spirit of God hovered? The Phoenician cosmology says the earth began with an egg, and they try to base that back on verse 2 and the water here in verse 6. God hovering over it is like a mother bird. And in your notes, I've listed where God is called female in the Bible. And He is. He encompasses the best that's female and the best that's male, because He thought of both. But the idea here is not that of a primeval egg, but God actively involved in history. From the New Testament, we learn that Jesus is God's agent of creation, and the references to that are in your notes. They'll be helpful to look at that. And so He separated the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below and the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called. Now the idea here about God called, it's used in verse 5, verse 8, verse 10, and twice. God is naming, and His naming is so significant because it shows His control and ownership. Excuse me. And God called the dry land earth, Adamah. Now there's going to be a relationship between Adam and earth because man is taken from the earth. Some say that the root of Adam or Adamah is red, the idea of red clay, and that may be true. And He called the water seas, and it was good. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees. There's a threefold division here as I see it. Grasses, grains, and fruit. Now the first is going to be used primarily for the animals, though sometimes the animals eat grains too. The grains and the fruit are going to be primarily for man and the higher animals. Now if there's a distinction here between those, I'm not sure, but as man makes animals in man, this is food for him. This is not specific scientific classification of horticulture. It's simply a broad way of looking at different kinds of plants. So God brought forth the plant kingdom. And notice, as God created them originally, He created them to produce themselves from then on. I think we need to realize that there is some evolution. Now, scientific terms calls it macro and micro evolution. We've got to say that within certain kind of species there has been some development. We can see it so clearly in horses and dogs and the plant kingdom. But between species is what I'm not sure we have evidence for in science. And the theories that we base it on sometimes say more about us than they do about the evidence. Now, excuse me, my nose itches. It must be creation. I'm allergic to it. Notice in verse 12. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, trees bearing fruit, and seed in them after their kind, and God saw it was good. The plant kingdom is in His purpose. And it was evening and morning, the third day. Now, it seems to me that the rabbis say evening and morning. They say the day began the evening. And so that's why they start their Sabbath at 6 o'clock on Friday, run to 6 o'clock on Saturday. Because of this account in Genesis. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of heaven and separate the day from the night. Here's the creation of the luminaries. Now, this is very important, for many of the ancient world believed the stars guided their destiny. No, the stars are a creation of God. They are not lesser gods. This whole baloney about astrology is absolutely the pit. It's superstitious man trying to manipulate his own life. Now, notice where it mentions, to let them be signs for seasons and days and years. These stars and the moon and the sun are primarily for man to mark off cycles of his life. Now, whether that be cycles for religious days or cycles for rest and work, I'm really not sure, but that's what we're talking about here. Now, then it says, and God made two greater lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. And He made the stars also. You know, we'll see Psalms 19, 1 through 6. What a beautiful, beautiful account of the sun in a personified form as serving God. Okay? Sun worship is an example of man awed by his own creation, trying to manipulate. It just won't hack it. Now, notice that in verse 20, we're going to have a few more plants are going to go, and then life forms, like fish and birds and animals, smaller animals. Let the waters teem. Now, literally, the Hebrew is swarm with swarms, living creatures. This is the term nephesh. It's used of man and of animals. It means life force. And let birds fly. Those with above flying things. It's used in Deuteronomy 14, 19, and 20 for insects. So anything that flies in the firmament that God separated the waters with. I like it where God plays with the animals. He loves them. He plays with them. He enjoys them. And God created the Leviathan. Now, Leviathan, we call it usually the sea monster. I don't think it's dinosaurs, nothing like that. It's a large sea animal, whether it's a whale or a porpoise, I'm not sure. Dragon, I'm not sure what it is, but it's mentioned several times in the Bible, especially in Psalms and Job, and God enjoys it and plays with it. In the Canaanite cosmologies, it is a monster, a god. Not so the Bible. But I tell you what, God sure loves the animals, and many times He plays with them and cares about them and provides for them. And notice that these different land animals and sea animals and birds, they're going to produce after their kind. Okay? God created initially, and then they're going to produce. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Well, I'll tell you what, there's one command that man has fulfilled, and the animals too. They're to fill the earth. That wasn't that the water's totally full of them, but the population that can support because of the food chain. And that's what we have here. And it was the evening and the morning, the fifth day. Well, that's the end of the first section I'm going to do. Next week we're going to be dealing with the rest of chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2. I want to say again, isn't this a wonderful account? It's so simple, and yet it's so tremendously accurate as far as the presentation of truth. Now you say, well, is this scientific? I believe all truth is from God. If science someday can prove that this was done in a different way, it will not destroy my view of God. But I want to tell you what, at this point, this seems to be a very accurate, step-by-step specialization of the earth and man. How is not the key. But there is a God that loves us. A God that wants us to know Him even though we've rebelled. A God that through Jesus Christ has called us out of the darkness into His marvelous light. As He created the light out of the darkness of creation, He's created the light out of the darkness of sin. This is the first glimpse we have of Him. He had been working a long time in His heart and mind before He began to create. But God did it. And oh, He's going to pick one to pick many. But the great truth is, friend, He's picked you. He's picked you. And He wants you to know Him. And Genesis sets the stage for that. Here, creation. Next week, fellowship with man. Chapter 3, man's rebellion. But God wouldn't give up. God wouldn't give up. I've enjoyed being with you. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. God bless you.